to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt. Moses confronted Pharaoh. Do you remember how that went when Moses confronted Pharaoh the first time? Good or bad? Bad. Very bad. In fact, it went so bad that the leaders of Israel stormed out of that meeting and said, "God, may God judge you, Moses, for what you've done to us." So, Moses got off to a rough start. Today, though, we are going to see that God was still working. God was still working. So we're going to pick up in Exodus chapter 7. Exodus chapter 7. Okay, and because this crowd is probably more versed in the scriptures, we know the basic structure of the Exodus, right? 10 plagues of Exodus, Charlton Heston movie, blood and fire and holy terror and death and all that good stuff. Lice and frogs and boils and such. There's a pattern that I want you to see today. You see, the judgments in Exodus were not just some haphazard God is throwing everything he's got at Israel. The judgments in Exodus proceed according to a very specific, interesting pattern. And it's in your outline. This is all in your outline. You can find it here on the board too. We're going to see the pattern first. I'm going to explain the pattern by showing it to you. So let's start in Exodus chapter 7. Exodus chapter 7. We're going to pick up in verse 14. As always, the hope is that this is a discussion, so as you guys have thoughts or questions, please chime in. So in Exodus 7:14, the Lord said unto Moses, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. He refuses to let the people go. Now let me ask you a difficult question. Who hardened Pharaoh's heart?
The Lord.
In Exodus. Sometimes the Lord hardens Pharaoh's heart. Sometimes Pharaoh hardens his own heart. Sometimes it says something like, and he hardened his heart, and you're just left to scratch your head, who's hardening whose heart? We have a cool thing I'll show you at another time about Pharaoh hardening his heart. To give you a little preview, the first time for sure anybody ever hardens their heart, for sure, we can be 100% certain about it, it's Pharaoh hardening his own heart. And then you have a couple times where it goes back and forth between God and Pharaoh. God will harden his heart, and then Pharaoh will harden his heart, and they'll go back and forth. And then when the last 3 plagues start, it's like somebody hits a light switch, and after that, it's God every time. God hardened Pharaoh, God hardened Pharaoh, God hardened Pharaoh. So that's kind of a scary takeaway, is that if you resist God long enough, eventually he turns the lights out in you. But we're not there yet. So Pharaoh's heart is hardened. In verse 15, God says to Moses, Get thee unto Pharaoh in the morning, and go out unto the water. Okay, the first plague in the first series. You see, there are 3 series of 3 plagues. It proceeds in a pattern of 3 plagues. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and then the last plague hits. And what's the last plague? The great judgment?
It's killing of the firstborn, wasn't it?
The death of the firstborn. The death of the firstborn. Firstborn sons. And that's kind of a special thing that's on its own. All the plagues leading up to that proceed in these series of 3s. In each series of 3, the first plague, God sends Moses to Pharaoh in the morning. Each time, in the morning. We see it here in verse 15. Get thee unto Pharaoh in the morning, lo, he goes out unto the water. Now the Nile River in Egypt was the center of religious and life, center of religious life and life generally. Because they farmed off of the Nile, if the Nile didn't work right, everybody starved, like happened in Joseph's time. The Nile's a really big deal. And one of Pharaoh's job every morning is to go out to the Nile, and I'm going to simplify a little bit, and talk to the God of the Nile and make sure everything is good. Because if the God of the Nile is not happy, nobody's eating in Pharaoh's world. And remember, Pharaoh's a god himself, so they can talk about God stuff together. Supposedly. Get thee unto Pharaoh in the morning, he goes out into the water. Thou shalt stand by the river's brink against him, and the rod which was turned to a serpent shalt thou take in thine hand, in verse 15. And thou shalt say in verse 16, The Lord God of the Hebrews has sent me unto thee, saying, Let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness. And behold, hitherto thou wouldst not hear. Thus saith the Lord in verse 17, In this thou shalt know I am the Lord. Do you remember how we talked about God's name last time? How important God's name is? Now God is revealing his name to Pharaoh. I am. Can you guys remind me, what are some of the significances of the name I am? What does it tell us about God? Remember that Pharaoh thinks he's a god. So when you think you're a god, and you go out to the Nile to talk to the god of the Nile, to talk about God stuff, to make sure everybody can eat, when somebody comes to you and says, I have a message from I am the Lord, that's kind of a big deal. There's a sense in which through the whole set of plagues, Pharaoh thinks he's a god. And so the Lord is saying, okay, Pharaoh, I'm going to deal with you as you think you are. I'm going to judge you as the God that you think you are. And that's a terrifying thing. What does Moses do? What do you guys remember? What does Moses do? Look, we can look in the text. The first plague, behold, I will smite with a rod that is in my hand upon the waters which are in the river, in verse 17, and they shall be turned to what?
Blood.
Blood. The first plague is a plague against the Nile River. As Pharaoh is going out in the morning to talk to the god of the Nile, Moses turns the rivers of the Nile into blood. Now, what's the significance of blood in the Nile? Where have we seen in the narrative of Exodus, and we didn't go through it very much, but you might remember, in the narrative of the Exodus, where have we seen the Nile and a whole lot of dying come up in the beginning of the book of Exodus?
Oh, how about when they were going to kill they were killing all the children?
Yes.
And Moses was putting a reed basket in the
Yes. The children of Israel were being killed in the attempted genocide by throwing them in the Nile. And so here in the first plague, God is saying, okay, see what you have done. And he turns the rivers of the Nile into blood. Do you see God's justice in this? This isn't like haphazard, I'm going to throw some plagues at these people. This is on purpose. This is justice. So the Nile turns to blood. And that's always the first one. So for the first plague, the fourth plague, 5, 6, 7, 8th plague, 7th plague, you always see it happens in the morning. God sends Moses to Pharaoh. Now let's see the next one. The consequences in verse 18. The fish that is in the river shall die, the river shall stink, the Egyptians shall loathe to drink the water thereof. So Moses does this, and this remarkable miracle takes place. In verse 20, so Exodus 7:20, and Moses and Aaron did so as the Lord commanded. He lifted up the rod and smote the waters that were in the river in the sight of Pharaoh and the sight of his servants. All the waters that were in the river were turned to blood. The fish died, the river stank, the Egyptians couldn't drink of the water. Now in verse 22, the magicians of the Egyptians did so with their enchantments. We don't know how this worked exactly, but somehow the magicians, the professional magicians that worked for Pharaoh, were able to do something like this. You kind of have an arms race. Pharaoh doesn't have any trouble believing in gods and believing that the Hebrews have a God. The question is, isn't the Hebrew God weaker than me because I've enslaved the Hebrews? So he gets his staff that works for him and says, hey, can you guys do this? And they can do it, sort of. What would have been more helpful for them to do, though?
Listen to the Lord that turned the Nile red.
Yeah, well, Kathy's got the big right answer. But the more selfish right answer is, wouldn't it have been more helpful if they could have turned the Nile back to water?
Oh, yeah.
Wouldn't that have been better?
Yeah.
But whatever, that's hard, so at least they can throw some stuff in the water and make it red. So they do so. Now, Pharaoh does not respond. Chapter 8 picks up with the second plague. The picture we have of the second plague is that it typically happens in the late afternoon, in the evening. God always sends Moses to Pharaoh in the morning in the first plague. And then as the sun is going down in the late afternoon and the evening, God sends Moses to Pharaoh to confront him again. The Lord spake unto Moses, go unto Pharaoh. So this is 8:1. Go unto Pharaoh. Thus saith the Lord, let my people go. Why? In verse 1, in 8:1. Why?
They may serve.
They may serve. I would bet that every time, but certainly I know that almost every time, When God says, let my people go, he says, let my people go so that they can serve me. And the context of service here is worship. God's message to Pharaoh is, let my people go so that they can have a worship service. They are saved to worship, saved to serve. That's true of your life too as a Christian. You have been saved out of the world to serve God. Israel was saved out of Egypt to worship God. Saved to serve. Let my people go so that they can worship me. Thus saith the Lord, let my people go so that they may serve me. Now, Pharaoh always gets a warning with the second plague. There's always a big warning. God makes a big deal about warning Pharaoh. And we see it here in verse 2. Cause the frogs to come upon the land of the Egyptians. And Aaron did it in verse 6. Then Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron and said, entreat the Lord that he may take away the frogs from me and from my people, and I will let them go. Moses tomorrow, whenever you get around to it, Moses, tomorrow. And you can bet in his heart, Pharaoh's like, I want the frog gone now. But he wants to seem like he's in control. He wants to seem like he's in control. Be it according to thy word, that thou mayest know that there is none like unto the Lord our God. Remember, Pharaoh thinks he's a god, so that really stings me. 15, what happens? When Pharaoh saw that there was a respite, what happened?